time. I'm really excited to be sharing the study. So this was just published yesterday in the Bank's Policy Research Working Paper series. But really, this was a technical background study to the Poverty and Shared Prosperity report that the Poverty Group led and published, I think, about 2 weeks ago now. As Lana mentioned, this was done in collaboration with Melda Salhab at UCL in London, but there were a bunch of people who helped us along the way. I won't try to mention them all, but especially from the Poverty Group, DEC, the GHOST team, and our own GPERL group. The goal of the study is really quite simple. The title kind of says it, and these are really the two simple questions we try to answer. First of all, how many people live in flood zones around the world? And then how many of them are poor? I think what makes this study interesting is this global coverage that we have thanks to a couple of high-resolution global data sets that we were able to use. So we estimate these numbers for 189 countries. We also have them further disaggregated for over 2,000 subnational administrative units. With that, we get with it into rounding errors of the whole world population. And this whole analysis is kind of ground up high resolution using 90 by 90 meter spatial resolution data sets. The motivation for this question, in the first place, I won't really get into this. I think many of you will be familiar with the bank's work on disaster risk management and how natural disasters can impact development outcomes, poverty eradication efforts, how single disasters can roll back years of progress in these areas. Just recently, actually also for the Poverty and Shared Prosperity report, our colleagues estimated, for instance, that climate change could push an additional 132 million people into extreme poverty just within the next 10 years. So really these numbers are serious, and that's kind of the motivation why we looked into this question of how many people are exposed and where are they located, in particular for flood hazards. This is kind of the classic framework that we use to frame these questions. What drives disaster losses? It's the hazards themselves. What kind of shocks are we talking about? Where do they hit? With what kind of assets are exposed? Where are the people located that are exposed to these hazards? Once the shock hits, how vulnerable are people? So how much damage does it actually cause? This can be very different for some buildings collapse immediately while others get away without any damage, for instance, during earthquakes. So the vulnerability question, and finally the socioeconomic resilience question, which is about once damage occurs, what is the capacity of people to cope with these damages and recover quickly thanks to, for instance, support systems that the government has in place. In this study, we really focus on this area, first of all, on flood hazards. We look at where are people located, to what extent are they exposed to these hazards, and by looking into poverty rates, we also have a proxy for the vulnerability of exposed people. I'll go through the data sets because I think it is that we use for the study, because I think it's important for understanding what these estimates actually contain and where they come from. And I can illustrate that using this example for the metropolitan area of Colombo in Sri Lanka, where we can visualize these data sets. The first one are flood hazard maps. Many of you will be familiar with these. We use these a lot at the bank to estimate exposure to flood risks. For those who are not familiar with this, they capture different kinds of flooding and tell you what is the expected inundation depth during a flood event of a certain probability. So for our study, we choose a 1 in 100 year return period, which, if you're not familiar with this concept, basically means there is, on average, in the long term, a likelihood of occurrence in a 100-year window of once. In other words, in a given year, you have a 1% probability of this kind of flood event occurring. That might not sound like a lot, but once you think about the cumulative probability, it is actually not as rare as you might think. So for instance, in a 10-year window, this kind of flood has a 10% chance of occurring, or in a statistical lifetime of around 60, 70 years, the probability is already around 50%. So that's well within the planning horizons of many governments. And for comparison, for instance, if you buy a house in the US, you're legally required to purchase flood insurance if your house is located in a 1 in 100-year flood zone. One thing important to point out is that the flood hazard maps that we use do not account for flood protection structures like dikes or drainage systems, mostly because these are global models based on so hydrological and digital elevation models that do not account for physical artificial structures. That is a problem perhaps in some high-income countries, but most of the countries where we work and that we're interested in, this picture is actually relatively close to the truth. In addition, we use the latest population density maps. These are widely available. They are calibrated based on administrative census information and satellite imagery, basically telling us where population is located and concentrated, and the distribution of people, essentially. The third and final ingredient is from the World Bank's own global monitoring database of harmonized household surveys. And from that, we take for each subnational region that you can see here, as an example for Sub-Saharan Africa, we take the poverty headcount rates for using different definitions of poverty. So I'll quickly go through how we put all of these ingredients together to arrive at our results. It's really pretty simple. Just a kind of stylized illustration. This is what a population density map looks like for a given country. It's a chessboard grid. Every pixel tells you how many people are estimated to be living in a certain location. We overlay that with the flood hazard maps, which we categorize into 5 different risk zones. The lowest one being no risk. So during a flood event, there's no inundation expected or estimated to occur in these areas. All the way to category 5, which we classify as very high risk, where inundation exceeds 150 centimeters. We also broadly group these 5 into the 2 low risk and high risk classes that we'll use to present some of the data later. Once we merge these and overlay them, we can identify the areas where people are located, and so where people, settlements and flood risk coincide. And this is one of the outputs, and I'll show you what this looks like in a minute, but this is one output of the study which perhaps can be useful for our teams. The next step is that we aggregate this information using these subnational boundary maps that match the World Bank's poverty the poverty group's household surveys and their statistical representativeness. So we basically, for each subnational unit, we add up all the exposed people from the risk map, and we aggregate them up, and we get to these exposure tables that look like this. And we can further aggregate these to the country level. So really, this is a fairly simple process. This is primary school math in a way. It's counting and adding. What made it complicated is the sheer volume of data. So this is a 19 by 90 meter resolution, all these layers for 500, I think 10 million square kilometers of landmass. So it's around 60 billion pixels that we process and go through these loops of counting them. So what does this look like in practice? So going back to Colombo to illustrate that, we can now highlight the areas where people and flood risk coincide. So this, in the left part, for instance, you can see the downtown, some parts of downtown Colombo where you have a coincidence of both high population density and high flood risk. But you can also see towards the right in the more rural, sparsely populated periphery that you have pockets of population exposure that we might not always think about. We can zoom in a little bit to understand, to get a kind of feel for the level of resolution that we're looking at here. So now you can see the individual pixels, that's our level of analysis in comparison to buildings and fields and so on. So I think it's important to note that we can't really use this as a, for instance, substitute for a post-disaster needs assessment. These are globally modeled data sets with certain levels of inaccuracy, of course, but we can use this to get a feel for the orders of magnitude of the number of people who are exposed, for instance, and link to that the needs in a post-disaster situation. We can get an estimate, for instance, for the recovery needs, perhaps order of magnitude for the social protection payments that could be required if an event like this occurred. So going kind of from the pixel level, we can start aggregating this up towards administrative units to get a sense of what this looks like. So here we show for each subnational unit the number of people who we estimate to be located in flood risk zones in absolute terms. So these are millions, and quite naturally you start seeing as the highest number of people who are exposed to flood risks are in South Asia, East Asia. And this is to some extent simply a function of where you have high population densities. And these are the most populous regions that we look at. I think this becomes a bit easier to interpret once we start kind of slicing this information into different ways. So first of all, this is if the whole bar is the world's population of almost 8 billion people, we estimate that we have about 5.6 billion in low-risk zones, so people who we estimate to not have any flooding occurring during a flood event. But we also have about 1.5 billion people who we estimate to experience at least a moderate level of inundation, so at least 15 centimeters. But almost 800 million people actually had fairly significant flood levels of over 50 centimeters. We can break down this 1.5 billion of exposed people into various ways. We, at the bank, of course, have several classic ways of doing that. So here are our regions. The interesting bit here perhaps is, first of all, South Asia and East Asia really stand out as the places where we have the most number of people exposed to flood risk. But also we have significant numbers in basically all regions. And again, the size of South Asia and East Asia in these blocks is to some extent simply that these are the most populous regions, of course. We can also group these into income classes. So here are our standard income classifications for countries. What we see is that about 160 million people that are flood exposed live in high income countries, but the vast majority, almost 90%, live in low and middle income countries. And lastly, we have about 153 million people who are flood exposed and living in FCV countries. We can start looking at this on a map in some different ways to understand a bit better how this risk distributes and what drives it. So here, similar to the earlier map, but here now we see the share of the total population that is exposed to flood risks. There are several interesting points perhaps to note. So first of all, there are significant shares of population exposed in basically all regions, basically all countries. You have these pockets of risk. I highlighted here the areas where less than 1% of the population lives in flood zones, and it's really basically only in the middle of the Sahara. I think what you can also tell from this map is that a lot of the high-risk hotspots are located in coastal zones and near low-lying, densely populated river basins, and that is across all income groups. In the US, you see Louisiana, New Orleans, and the Mississippi Delta popping out as a high-risk zone. You see the Netherlands, you see the Nile region, the Euphrates Basin in South Asia, the Bangladesh, the Irrawaddy River in Myanmar, the Mekong Delta, and so on, and some coastal regions in East Asia as well. What's perhaps less clear is where risk is concentrated once we start looking at different measures of risk. One classic way of doing that, of course, is to look at GDP or economic activity exposed. So here we multiply the number of people in each administrative unit with an estimate of this subnational GDP per capita. And this is no perfect measure, of course, but it gives us a sense of the volume or the magnitude of economic activity at risk. And I summed it up in the bar chart at the bottom right. And what you can see basically is the risk is most pronounced in high-income countries. About 50% of the economic activity exposed here is in high-income countries. And that really illustrates also the bias that we often have if we look at these economic indicators as risk indicators, because even though it's 50% of economic activity, high-income countries actually only account for 11% of the exposed population. So this is really not a great way of identifying risk hotspots if we're interested in vulnerability and where these floods kind of have more devastating impacts on livelihoods. You might have noticed, so for instance, sub-Saharan Africa here is not highlighted at all. That picture changes once we take into account poverty measures as a way to understand where flood exposure coincides with poverty and associated with that with vulnerability of the population. So here here you see for each administrative unit, you see the share of the population that is both flood exposed and living in extreme poverty, so living on less than $1.90 a day. That adds up to 132 million people globally, with over half of them being located in sub-Saharan Africa. Of course, the $1.90 measure is a fairly extreme definition of poverty, especially if you consider that floods affect also near poor and kind of near poor households who may fall back into poverty because of such natural shocks. So we also looked at other definitions of poverty. For instance, using the $3.20 definition, we already start seeing that several more risk hotspots, for instance, in Latin America, in South Asia, East Asia Pacific as well. Then last, one more poverty definition. If we use $5.50, that picture just kind of intensifies, and now we start seeing these risk hotspots in many regions. How does this all stack up? So here we here on this graph, you can see for each poverty threshold, so the $1.90, $3.20, and $5.50 definition, the number of people who are flood exposed. The 1.5 million is the total global flood exposure head count, and then you can see the regions, how they are represented in the poor share of this, if you will. So you see that for the extreme poverty definition, for instance, about half is in sub-Saharan Africa, but once we use a more kind of relaxed poverty threshold of 550, South Asia dominates the picture here. Then I just want to finish with a couple of kind of thoughts and comments on that relationship between flood exposure and poverty. One thing we can do, for instance, here is to simply plot all the 2,200 administrative units by their income levels and by the share of population that's flood exposed. You might, with a bit of imagination, see kind of a downward sloping relationship here. So poorer areas having higher flood exposure. But there is also a very dense cloud kind of in the bottom left corner of areas with low income, but also not very high exposure. So rather than kind of force-fitting and over-interpreting a regression line into this, I just want to mention a couple of factors that kind of drive this. And it's a complex relationship, and the way the relationship works can be different at different levels of analysis. So let me just illustrate that. So this is from a study in Vietnam. You can see on the left district level poverty rates, and on the right flood risk map. And you see that poverty rates tend to be fairly low in the coastal regions and the two big river deltas in the north and the south, which is also exactly where flood risks are particularly high. So at this country level, you can see that richer regions tend to be more exposed to flood risks. And this is also close to the level of analysis that we did at the global level. But once you look at local level studies, for instance, this one for Ho Chi Minh City, you actually see that the relationship is exactly the other way around. So just the takeaway here from the right diagram is that slum areas identified through also satellite imagery, they tend to have a significantly higher share of people being exposed to flood risks than the overall city. So kind of how do these two pieces fit together? It's really the level of analysis that we're looking at here. There are several factors kind of driving this relationship. My slide was stuck. Okay, so this is a different study by my colleague Alvina Erman, who looked at a similar question for Dar es Salaam and had a much more refined data set, dedicated household data set collected exactly to look at these kinds of questions. And what you see from this study is that flood-exposed households, they tend to be poorer, but also they tend to have less secure tenure arrangements. They don't have the same quality of drainage systems, which are essential for flood management and public services. And another important piece here of the puzzle is that dwellings in flood-exposed, flood-prone regions, neighborhoods, tend to be about 30% less. So the estimated value of these dwellings is about 30% less, which kind of gives you an idea of what happens when you have these fast-growing urban areas in coastal zones, for instance. So people, low-income households from rural periphery regions move into high-risk zones, and all that is left are the cheaper high-risk areas. So you see a tendency of local sorting of low-income households towards these high-risk neighborhoods. Just the last piece to illustrate that again, in Vietnam here we looked at nightlight growth over a couple of years and asked whether high growth areas tend to have higher risk, and that's kind of exactly what we see. So lower growth areas already have a significant share of have a significant flood risk. But once you look at the higher risk, the higher growth areas, so where development and settlement is happening in the last few years, risk is significantly higher than in the existing areas, which kind of illustrates this point that safe land is already occupied, people are moving into higher risk areas because that's all that's free and that's what's more affordable. So all this is just to illustrate and kind of point out that while we have all these global estimates, the picture at the local level can be quite complex, and we need to pair this high-level global analysis also with some of these more kind of detailed analyses of the drivers of risk in specific locations. I'll perhaps leave it at that. The data that we produced for this, so for instance, these risk maps, we have these for any location in the world. We save them out. We can work with teams if that's of interest to produce these maps. Perhaps I found these can be useful, for instance, in client dialogue and so on. And we are, of course, also will share all the estimates of flood exposure. We're still trying to figure out what's the most efficient way of making these available. So I'll be curious to hear your thoughts, maybe how you think this might be useful for your work. So I'll leave it at that. Perhaps back to Lana. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, June. I've got a few questions before we open it up to other colleagues. The first is, how do these maps consider climate change and the future more generally? So increased urbanization or increased hard surfaces, which means more runoff, but also more changing weather patterns, sea rise, etc. So that would be a question. I think what's really clear is scale matters, and depending on the type of analysis how you're doing it at, you can get quite different answers. And I think this study is actually quite useful showing why scale matters and very much the need for, while you use global scale very good and they shared insights, the need is highly detailed local studies. I think it was really cool. And I'm glad you mentioned about access to these maps and generally access to this data, both like the poverty data sets, but also I think the Fathom, if teams are wanting to use that. And then I guess my last point, has the team looked at sort of cross-checking areas where we know we have high resolution flood maps? The level of uncertainty that's generated by Fathom flood map, in the sense that we know that it doesn't have the protection, it's basically a global analysis. Just wondering if you've done other teams members have done some comparisons of the sort of the global picture versus national flood maps. So those are a couple of questions from my side. While you address those, if you have other questions, you can either let me know in the chat and I can call on you, or you can leave your question in the chat. Please go ahead.
Perhaps climate change and equity and the intersection.
And Rebecca, do you mind muting, please?
Criteria types of methodology. So
Rebecca?
I'm not sure whether that's a question. I can't really hear it very well.
No, I don't think it's a question. I think she's talking around, so she needs to mute it. I think, June, you can mute her first, or maybe not.
Okay, I'm not the host, so I'm...
Okay. Well, if someone can message her. Otherwise, maybe just go ahead to the question if you can.
Yeah, I'll try to shout and not get distracted. Yeah, thanks, Lana, for those comments. I think I should have mentioned, so this is really a snapshot. We are using the latest available data that shows us current risk and current population locations, but we don't really comment on where's the direction of travel, kind of. So where's urbanization headed? How do these probabilities of these kinds of events change over time? We are looking into these questions, but we haven't really covered that in this study. So I think the two main ingredients to change, well, for this study would be the location of people. So how quickly do these urban shapes change? How quickly do people move into these high-risk flood zones? So none of these estimates are really set in stone, but they're constantly changing. The second ingredient is the probability of the intensity of these events. So what we now call a 100-year event, in a few years we might call that a 20-year event, because these probabilities are also not set in stone. They're constantly changing. As new data becomes available, our understanding of what an intense event is changes as well. So that is really also something that I think we should be looking at more, is how the probabilities of intense events change. Then on the Fathom data, so I'm not sure whether my colleagues from the labs team are connected, so they really led the development and collaboration with the company that produced these maps. My understanding is that these are kind of the state-of-the-art maps that we have available at the global level. We've done several local analyses where we had alternative flood maps available that were supposed to be better because of more accurate modeling, and found that in those kind of cases that we looked at, the comparison actually held up pretty well. But that's not a complete comparative study. So we don't, I mean, there might well be places where the Fathom maps are pretty off. But we haven't encountered those cases yet. Maybe somebody else has different experiences. And Yeah, so just on also making these results available. So this isn't really kind of the approach that we take here isn't anything new. These exposure studies, many teams at the bank, we've done them for a long time, comparing risk locations with population maps. I think the kind of contribution we try to offer here is that we process the whole global lot in one go and try to make these outputs available so that we have everything pre-processed, and if we are looking at a certain location, we have it ready to go sitting on OneDrive. So we just need to visualize the output rather than going through the whole overlay exercise each time. So yeah, maybe I'll stop there.
Right, thank you. Well, we have questions coming in. So the first was from Brendan about how did the estimates from your study to past studies being done? Are you higher, lower, or broadly comparable? And did you use the unprotected or the protected version of the Fathom? I think I heard you said you used not considering flood protect, but certainly it'd be interesting. I mean, did you check how the results change if you look at flood protection or not flood protection? And then from Anuja, whether or not administrative boundary, presumably difference of subnational administrative boundaries were imposed, and at what scale might be for planning decisions. So those are 3 questions. And answer those. Anybody else, please put in your questions.
Yeah, thanks, Brendan. Great to see you're connected. So Brendan did a study that was pretty similar, I think, a couple of years ago. And the difference, I think, here is simply time has passed. So we see that the data sets that were updated, first of all, the resolution is a bit higher. And now they capture some of these pretty rapid development trends that we've seen. So especially rapid urbanization in these coastal zones, low-lying river basins, which were simply not the case in data sets, for instance, 10 years ago. So compared to those studies, our our estimates are similar but higher. So we see that I think in Brendan's study, for instance, the number of people that was projected to be exposed by 2020, according to that, we actually exceeded that by 10% or 15% or something like that. I'll need to compare that again. But there are several factors that drive that difference. It's the higher resolution data sets. We also take into account coastal flooding, which is in addition to the Fathom maps, and then simply the reality on the ground of increased urbanization and populations in high-risk zones. We haven't tried using the protected versions of the flood maps, partly because the way I understand that these protection is built into these flood maps is not actually based on actual infrastructure systems that are then used to so if there's a dike and a certain area is protected, it's not spatially representative of that protection, but rather there are certain economic factors that are used to downscale the risk. So it's not as spatially accurate as the rest of the maps, the unprotected version of the maps. So we simply use the unprotected versions. And maybe a side note on that. So we did a relatively in-depth study of that in Vietnam, where we had available a detailed map of existing coastal protection systems, so a dike map essentially. And that dike map also showed us the level of protection that we have for each dike. So what we see there is that most of the dikes, even though they're in place, their protection level that they allow is pretty low. So something like 1 in 20 years, 1 in 30 years. So the type of events that we're considering here well exceed the existing protection levels, even in Vietnam, which is a very advanced country in terms of flood protection infrastructure. The last question, I didn't quite catch something about administrative units. you were broken off for a bit there.
I can completely understand myself. Would you want to come in and ask a question directly?
Yeah, hi, am I audible?
Yes, very well.
Yes, so my question is that because this is at a particular scale, was this study used to kind of, superimpose any administrative boundaries? For example, in India, we have districts, states, villages, when you can actually connect it to the administrators to use these vulnerability assessments. So was any attempt done to superimpose those legal administrative boundaries on this data so that it can be used by the administrators for reference?
Yeah, thanks. So we aggregated up our estimates to administrative units, and we used the administrative boundaries that the poverty group at the bank uses because the existing socioeconomic estimates from household surveys are representative at these administrative levels, so subnational administrative levels. So we have the estimates for district, I think in India it would be states, I guess, or provinces in other countries, but not every country has this level of granularity. So for instance, in Argentina, we don't have subnationally representative household surveys at the bank, so we simply have a country level estimate. But the kind of nice thing about these risk maps that you still see here in the background is that we can aggregate these, so we can just extract the head count of exposure for any kind of area that you define. So we could look at a given valley or a small town or a village or the periphery of Colombo without being bound to these administrative areas, but we could simply define any kind of area that we're interested in and extract the number of people at flat risk.
Thank you, June. Thank you so much.
June, while other people come in with questions, I have a sort of a broad question. It's been now several years since, yes, Stefan and your team came with this idea of looking beyond assets to sort of the socioeconomic resilience and looking at sort of as a way of maybe prioritizing influence in resilience in RM. Have you seen that shift actually happen now in some of the projects that are being planned in bank regions, that they're starting to take this more holistic view of beyond loss, if you like, as a way of prioritizing interventions? And I brought up Vietnam and that very interesting study. So I was just wondering if you want to comment on that.
Yeah, thanks. I think it's a bit of a shift in mindset that's needed and I think already underway. And so I worked in the last 2 years quite closely on Vietnam. So we had several more in-depth analyses and engagements there. And I think it's kind of what you're seeing there. You see the big economic hubs, Ho Chi Minh City and Hanoi. That's really where all the assets, the wealth, the economic activity is located. But I think both the bank team, but then also the counterparts are really trying to look beyond those two super hubs and trying to understand where are the engines of growth outside of these two cities. They are focusing a lot on the coastal regions now because even though they are not as populated yet, there's a lot of urban growth happening, a lot of industrial growth, a lot of investment. So kind of anticipating rather than looking back at past data, where have the biggest asset losses been, looking forward, trying to anticipate what are the drivers of development, which areas could be used as safe spaces for further investment and so on. So, and at the same time, also that more granular socioeconomic kind of lens that even within these relatively wealthy coastal zones, you still have these pockets of poverty, which are often overlooked at the averages. But once you look into detail into these municipalities, you see that there is this local sorting happening and that there are people being left behind, being pushed into high-risk zones because land prices are going up so rapidly and so on. So yeah, I mean, it's to your question, I think it's a process, but I would say it's definitely a shift in mindset that you can see. And I'm not sure whether we can take all the credit for that as the bank, but it's definitely, I think, visible.
Great. It seems like your presentation is quite comprehensive enough. There's not so many questions, but I think what I'll probably do have is if they're interested in getting access to these maps, this analysis, they contact you. Oh, sorry, Brendan's me. He raised his hand. I can't see the hands raised. Okay, Brendan, go ahead, and then we'll talk about access to the data and the information.
Thanks, and thanks you for the presentation. I think it's great work, and as you say, I think it really builds upon what was done before with higher resolution data. I think what I especially liked is the numbers that you presented as well on people who are exposed to floods and living in poverty and living below a certain poverty threshold, which I think is super interesting for us to help kind of steer or prioritize investments if we can bring it down to a granular level, basically within the country. So I think it'd be very interesting to think about how that information can be not only shared within the bank-wide level, but also really brought down to the CMU level. I work with sector leaders on that. So for me, it would be great if we can see if we can have these maps on a national level where we map the number of people exposed to different types of flooding, and as well as within these different income brackets from the most poor to the less poor, but also really link it in a very tangible way to the recommendations you're making on how social protection features come into that. What would be an estimate of the needs for social protection in the country for flooding based on the estimate that you make? And then perhaps looking at that flood protection issue, how could we reduce that number of poor people, especially subject to flooding, by investing in flood protection? And I wasn't saying that we should be using the Fathom flood protection maps, because I agree you get all kind of cross correlations where they assume that countries with higher GDP have higher flood protection. And but I think we can maybe think about it in a synthetic way or something to help at least steer thinking of investments. Thanks for the presentation again.
Yeah, thanks, Brendan. And I think, we're really keen to make this all available. Right now, I'm the bottleneck. So if you're interested in the output, you have to email me, and please do. Great if this is of use to you. But we are looking into how we can make this all available. I think there are kind of three pieces. So one is simply the pre-aggregated results at the administrative levels. We have that all available, so I can easily share those spreadsheets with you. The second is these risk maps. We have them all produced. If you're interested in a certain location, you'll just have to take this raster data set and plot it. So add some nice colors and make it look the way you want. And we can help with that. And the third piece is kind of more tailored analysis using these risk maps. And I think that's where, Brendan, what you mentioned with potentially including if in a location we know about existing protection infrastructure, we may be able to adjust these estimates. That would be great. So yeah, it's my homework to work on those to make that all available. And please do reach out if you think it's useful to what you're doing.
Yeah, thanks. If I might add one final point, we had an investment project already in Madagascar where we actually used these pattern maps to do an economic analysis on a project level for investments and then look at reduction of number of people affected by the investment, and also think about poverty aspects. And you might want to think about maybe you can offer that as a service or based on the results that you already have. If we can, for large scale infrastructure projects, use some of these estimates to at least have a first cut estimate of what would be the poverty reduction and effect of those investments. At least we found it useful with this granularity in Madagascar for an urban project. I can imagine especially for larger scale projects, it might be valuable. Yeah, no, great, thanks.
Great. And see Aliyah has already expressed interest from the transport team. So Aliyah, just reach out to Jude. Sounds like he has all the data. Any other questions? I'm sorry, seemingly I can't see hands raised, but I mean, I want to thank June. I did fantastic work, and I think it really does help with the initial dialogue with clients about some of these challenges. It also really helps with economic analysis, and it comes together the whole discussion from national to subnational. So I think this is super useful. I think having the data is great. And it's certainly, you know, I imagine any teams are going to find it very helpful. So thank you very much. I understand this is a series of presentations, so I would encourage everyone to look for the next sorry, I don't know what it is, but yeah, email. So
thanks. Yeah, maybe I can just add on this series. So maybe Brian wants to come in if he's connected. So we have a bunch of tools that we try to tailor to the needs of operational teams to help, for instance, with economic analyses and project design questions. And through this series, we're trying to basically present some of these and get the word out, so that if there's anything that you might find useful for your own projects, that we can have a more detailed conversation with you bilaterally to see how we might be able to use those. I see Brian is connected. Maybe you want to add.
Yeah, thank you. I would just add that the next session in 2 weeks is from our colleague Alvina Ehrman on the sort of differential impacts of gender through the context of disaster risk management. And that is a publication she's got coming out. She recently had her review, so that'll be an early presentation of that work.
Thank you very much, everyone, for joining. Hopefully one day soon we'll all be able to see each other in person, and other than just seeing your names on the screen. But it was great, and thank you very much, June. Fascinating presentation. So, everybody.
Thanks, Lana. Thanks for being available. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thanks, June. Thanks, Lana.
Thanks, bye.